Hey everyone, welcome to another sideboard tech video. So I think there's a consensus that a lot of you, or many of you, enjoy these videos, so I'm continuing. I start off with Temur, and then I moved on to Simic, and then now I'm going to cover Izzet. So as you can see, there's a pattern here. I'm just getting rid of this particular wedge. I guess Temur or Rug is a wedge, not a shard, but who cares? This 3-color combo. Next week I'll probably be putting up Gruul sideboard tech, and then I'm going to be moving on to other color combinations that specifically include black. So I know a lot of you are looking forward to Sultai and Jund. But today we're going to be going over Izzet. As some of you know, sideboard tech videos are basically the same concept as deck techs, but instead I'm going to be going over sideboard options in the current meta, in this case modern. Before we do, a quick disclaimer, this won't include every possible sideboard option. Obviously there's over 10,000 cards legal in modern. There's no way I'm able to cover all of it, but I'm going to be covering the ones that are most commonly used right now in the meta, or at least historically ones I used. The focus is going to be on cards that are mostly seen in the sideboard. So if there's a card that sees sideboard and main board play, but it's mostly in the side, I'm going to cover it. If it's mostly in the main, I'm not going to cover it. And again, it's mostly for brevity. Selections are based on the color combination in question, so you know, when you're playing an Izzet deck in comparison to a Simic deck or a Temur deck, you're playing a different kind of game. It's a different type of strategy. You have different cards at your disposal. You know, when you're playing Izzet, you don't have green, so you don't have the threats that green brings along with it, so your strategy in general is going to be different than, let's say, a Simic deck, so on and so forth. So again, these sideboard tech videos are built within the context of the color combination. And of course, as usual, I love hearing from you, what cards I missed. Again, there's going to be definitely a lot of cards that I missed, but I'm trying to focus on cards that are currently played in the meta. But I like hearing cards I missed because I like having discussions on that. So let's move on to land hate. So luckily, you still have access to red and Izzet, and red is basically the best color for land disruption or land destruction. You have basically everything at your disposal here. There's nothing in green really that you necessarily need that's better, definitely not better than the tools that you have in red. So starting with Alpine Moon, again, as I mentioned before, Alpine Moon is your very targeted, very surgical attack of lands. If for whatever reason Blood Moon is just not something you can play in your deck because maybe your mana base is also greedy, then Alpine Moon is basically your next best option in terms of shutting off a land and, you know, making it effectively. In this case, you're not making it a mountain. It's going to be able to produce any. It's going to be produce one mana of any color, which is, you know, not as good as Blood Moon. But again, you are targeting a non-basic land, and all of those, you know, cards, all those lands with the same name are going to be affected. So if you target Urza's Mine, all Urza's Mines are going to become basic lands. They're going to lose all of their abilities, and then your opponent won't be able to assemble Tron. Or you target Valakut, same concept here. All the Valakuts will not work. Yeah, so that's basically Alpine Moon. It's very targeted, and it does its job pretty well. Again, if you can't play Blood Moon. But Cleansing Wildfire is next. This is a new card, came up in Zendikar Rising. What I really like about this is that for 2 mana, you're destroying a land. Yes, your opponent's going to be able to replace it with a basic, but you don't really care. You're not doing this to necessarily make your opponent be short on mana. You're doing this to take out a land that's going to be problematic for you. Cavern of Souls, an Urza land, Valakut, whatever it may be. Again, you're targeting a specific land, and you're drawing a card at the same time. So cantrips, which is also very, very good, and you know, for 2 mana, it's doing quite a bit. I actually like Cleansing Wildfire, and I want to play it a lot more, and I'm trying to play it a lot more. Spreading Seas, you have access to blue, and Spreading Seas is an option here. I wouldn't say it's your best option. I think all the other cards here are basically better, including Cleansing Wildfire. But yeah, I mean, you could turn off one specific land, and in many ways that is actually better than Cleansing Wildfire, so I kind of take it back. The thing is that Spreading Seas can always be destroyed, right? And you know, then it stops being effective, whereas Cleansing Wildfire, as long as it resolves, it's taking care of that land. That land's not coming back. So Spreading Seas basically enchants a land, and that land then becomes an island, losing all other abilities and types. and you draw a card as well from Spreading Seas. So like Cleansing Wildfire, you're cantripping, but again, Spreading Seas is slightly more fragile because it could be countered like Cleansing Wildfire, but it could also be removed once it resolves. So gotta keep that in mind. Blood Moon, of course, is my go-to. It's my favorite. All my Teamer decks are almost certainly going to be built with Blood Moon in mind. Same for my Izzet decks and my Gruul decks. Blood Moon is basically very central to a lot of the style of game or style of play that I have. And it's just basically the nuclear bomb, right? It's basically saying all non-basic lands are now mountains. They lose all their abilities. They're just goners. And I think that makes Blood Moon basically your best land disruption card in Modern. And you can play it in red, and you could definitely play it in Izzet. Like 2 colors, one of them being red, Blood Moon becomes very easy to play. So if you can afford it in a mana base, Blood Moon all the way. Molten Rain still sees play. Destroy target land. If that land was non-basic, you're dealing 2 damage to that land's owner, or controller, I should say. This is good. I think it now loses favor, in my opinion, to cards like Cleansing Wildfire. If Molten Rain was a card you were running before, unless damage is really important to you. For me, I prefer drawing a card, honestly. But again, if your goal is to deprive your opponent of mana and make them miss their land drops essentially, or just basically be short on mana, let them be behind you, then Molten Rain is going to be your option, right? Because you're destroying the land, it's not coming back, it's not being replaced, whereas just Cleansing Wildfire would be. So again, this really depends on what your strategy is with your Izzet deck, but Izzet decks usually are not playing the mana denial strategy. They're playing land disruption, but not necessarily land denial or mana denial. So in that sense, Molten Rain becomes less useful, but still an option. Last but not least, Crumble to Dust. This is also kind of like a nuclear bomb, but it's very specific. It's a very targeted tactical nuclear bomb, I guess you can say, in the sense that you're going to be exiling a non-basic land, and then you're going to be removing it from the graveyard, hand, and library as well. So it's kind of like a surgical extraction, but for lands that are already on the battlefield. So 4 mana, kind of a lot for Modern, and it's kind of a lot for Izzet decks, because Izzet decks traditionally don't really ramp, and Izzet decks that do ramp are usually combo decks like Storm, so you're not really playing Crumble to Dust, let's be honest. So Crumble to Dust is going to be expensive. I think this is going to be a meta call for sure. If for whatever reason the 5 cards before it that you see here on the screen are not suitable, then I guess Crumble to Dust would be an option, but in my opinion, I would look at the other 5 first before you consider Crumble to Dust, because they all do their job. But if you can play Blood Moon, and if Alpine Moon for whatever reason is not affordable to you, then Crumble to Dust works. It'll shut down, Tron, because you're going to get rid of 1 Tron land and then all of the copies of that Tron land in the game. So Tron can no longer assemble. Same thing goes for Valakut. It is a strong effect, which is why it's 4 mana. But again, better options. Let's move on to Artifact and Enchantment Hate. So you lose access to green, and this is your problem in Izzet. So usually Izzet decks can't be as aggressive, and there are, I want to be correct here, there are definitely aggressive Izzet decks. I built them. But generally speaking, they lack the big butts. They lack the big creatures that green can bring them, or black can bring them, for example. So generally speaking, yes, I know. I'm sure you could list me out, 50 different big red and blue creatures, but I'm talking about Izzet here. I'm not talking about just red, blue, and some other color. So Izzet decks in general, you're losing green, which also means you're losing your ability to effectively target enchantments. So what you can do is target artifacts still, and you still have pretty good cards here. You have Ancient Grudge and a Braid. These are the 2 main ones that I would suggest. These are the 2 main ones that I see play, that see play in Izzet decks. There are plenty of other cards, but I really want to just focus on these 2, because honestly, these are probably the 2 that you're going to be playing, and you're most likely going to be playing a Braid over Ancient Grudge, in my opinion. I don't see why you would play Ancient Grudge over a Braid in an Izzet deck, but I want to give you both options, just in case. But realistically speaking, green is where you have much stronger responses to artifacts and enchantments, and usually together in 1 card. In Izzet, you lose that ability, so you're going to have to rely on cards like Engineered Explosives, which we'll see in a second, that's a bit more of a catch-all. And you could target enchantments that way. But you're only going to be able to target enchantments that have a mana cost of 2 or less when you're explosive. So again, your options here are reduced. You might have to lean on cards like Echoing Truth or something just to like bounce enchantments away temporarily. But yeah, so Izzet is gonna be weak here against enchantment decks. So just keep that in mind. Luckily, there are not too many enchantment decks in Modern, so you don't have to worry about that. Graveyard Hate, nothing changes. Nothing changes. Graveyard Hate is essentially colorless for all of Modern. Black has some cool tools that we'll get into once we get into the Black Sideboard tech videos, but this has been the same so far in 3 videos. It's going to be essentially the same in the Gruul one, except Ashiok won't be there. But let's go through these really quickly. Tormod's Crypt is it's a 0 costing card, artifact, sacrifice it, and exile all cards from target player's library. So it's a one-off. You play it, and your opponent basically is going to play around it until you crack it. It's good for a 0 mana artifact. It targets your opponent's graveyard, but it's going to be a one-time effect, right? So once you pop it, that's it, it's done. So you got to pop it at the right moment, and then sometimes you wait for the right moment and it never comes. So there's that flip side to Tormod's Crypt. So I think you have better options here. But if, for example, the other options don't make sense for you, for example, Grafdigger's Cage might not make sense for you if you're playing Uro, then Tormod's Crypt becomes an option and Grafdigger's Cage it doesn't. Surgical Extraction, free card. It's going to be in basically all my Sideboard Tech videos, no matter what the color combination is, because it's free. It's by free, I mean you can pay 2 life, not necessarily black. And again, Surgical Extraction is basically the most effective removal card in the game in terms of targeting cards in your graveyard, because you're going to target a card in the graveyard, and then you're going to remove it from your opponent's hand and library as well. So very, very powerful. It's an instant. You can pay 2 life, so you don't have to have mana open. Very, very, very brutal. You can remove your opponent's only win condition. I've done that. There's a match where I did that. It was hilarious, and my opponent conceded. You could remove your opponent's main threats. It's very, very powerful card. It's a mistake that it was, it was built using Phyrexian mana, but it is what it is. I usually play a mix of this and Grafdigger's Cage, honestly, in a lot of my decks. Speaking of which, Grafdigger's Cage, creature cards in graveyards and libraries can't enter the battlefield. Players can't cast spells from graveyards or libraries. Very powerful effect. It turns off Uro, it turns off Dredge, it turns off basically every graveyard strategy. Every graveyard strategy is going to be affected by Grafdigger's Cage. Also your graveyard strategy, so you have to keep that in mind. You also stop cards like... oh boy, I'm blanking. You could tell that I don't write up scripts for my videos. I like to do off-the-cuff stuff. But Collected Company is the card that I'm thinking about. There we go. I filibustered a bit. So Collected Company, for example, wouldn't work with Grafdigger's Cage on the battlefield because cards can't enter from your library, and that's what's happening. Creature cards can't enter your library from your library, and that's what's happening with Collected Company. So Grafdigger's Cage, a very powerful card. It's usually my go-to when I'm thinking about Graveyard Hate. But again, you might not want to play it if you're playing Uro yourself or if you have a graveyard strategy yourself. Relic of Progenitus, also very, very popular if they're not playing Grafdigger's Cage. Every turn, essentially, that is untapped, you're going to tap it. Your opponent's going to pick what card they remove from their graveyard, but they're going to have to do it. And when you pay 1, you can exile Relic of Progenitus, exile all cards from all graveyards, and draw a card. So as long as you don't really care about your graveyard that much, it's not really a resource for you, then Relic of Progenitus is pretty cool. You can, harass your opponent for many, many turns by just tapping it to have them exile a card. And then when the time is right, you strike, you pay 1 mana, and you get to draw a card at the same time. So it kind of cantrips, which is pretty cool. So again, very, very popular if Grafdigger's Cage is not for you. Soul Guide Lantern, one of the newer Graveyard Hate cards. Again, it's kind of like an evolution of the Graveyard Hate artifacts that we have already in Modern. So I'll read it really quickly. When Soul Guide Lantern is at the battlefield, exile target card from a graveyard. So it exiles a target card that you choose as it enters the battlefield, which is very cool. Sacrifice Soul Guide Lantern, exile each opponent's graveyard. So slightly better than Relic of Progenitus in this case because you're only targeting your opponent's graveyard, not yours. But it doesn't cantrip at the same time. Where now if you pay 1 and tap, sacrifice it, then you draw a card. So it's basically splitting off the effects of Relic of Progenitus, and Tormod's Crypt, I suppose, but mostly Relic of Progenitus here. I don't know. Some people play it. I guess it's a nice option if you bring it in against the wrong deck and you realize that, hey, I just want to draw a card here. It's going to be more beneficial to me. So Soul Guide Lantern, again, gives you a lot more options at, you know, the cost of other types of power level in terms of graveyard hate. It's going to be your call here and what you really want. I don't necessarily see a wrong choice. Ashok Dreamrender, again, since it has hybrid mana, you can cast it with 2 blue, which is possible in Izzet. And again, this is very, very powerful. Very, very powerful. Your opponent, if they can't deal with this, it's a big issue when you bring it in against the right deck, because you're going to cast it, you're going to -1 it, your opponent's going to mill 4 cards and then exile their graveyard. And you're going to do that 5 times. So that's a lot of change. That's 20 cards that they're milling over the lifespan of Ashok Dreamrender, plus all the cards that are going to their graveyard at the same time. That's huge, huge. I think a lot of people underestimate Ashok Dreamrender, actually. But the only reason I don't play it more often is honestly the 3 mana. And for 3 mana, I want to be doing other stuff, but I think even I am underestimating Ashok Dreamrender. I should probably be playing it more. Give it a shot. You'll see. When I have played with Ashok Dreamrender, or when it's been played against me, it's the worst feeling when it's being played against me. It's just the worst, because you can't do anything. If you can't kill it, it's brutal. Let's move on to creature hate. Luckily, you don't lose much not playing green when you're playing Izzet, and, you know, in comparison to Simic and Temur. So Engineering Explosives has always been on my list. It's your catch-all sweeper, in my opinion. It becomes less effective in 2-color decks, because now you're limiting yourself quite a bit in what kind of permanents you can target, but I still think it's relevant here in the creature hate spot. You can use it against token decks, you can use it against little weenie decks, or, you know, burn decks that have, you know, 1 CMC and 2 CMC creatures. Still very useful if you find yourself having issues dealing with decks that go wide, or if you need to target enchantments, like I was telling you before. Flame Slash, yeah, it sees play in the sideboard more than the main, believe it or not. Unless you're a Temur Delver player, then it's seeing more play in the main. But Flame Slash is an option here. It deals 4 damage to the target creature, which kills a lot more than Lightning Bolt. The only downside is that it's a sorcery, but it's an option for you if you need to up your red removal and you think 4 is sufficient, and you're not paying a life for it, which is useful, obviously. Vapor Snag, it's your go-to. It's a tempo card. It removes a creature temporarily and also makes your opponent lose a life, which is nice. When played at the right moment, you can win games. So Vapor Snag, very, very relevant in a deck like this. And by a deck like this, I mean Izzet decks in general. This is the type of card you want to play. Especially, again, Izzet lacks the big butt creatures in general. A lot of Izzet's creatures are great on offense, less so on defense. At least most of them. So, unless I guess I don't want to. I keep thinking about Thing in the Ice, but let's be honest, it's not a thing. So, yeah, Vapor Snag is gonna be a good option in your side, maybe even in your main. Honestly, again, it really depends on what you're trying to do, and it depends on your meta, but usually your side. Pyroclasm sees very little play nowadays, but historically was a card I played a lot. Still see some fringe play in the sideboards. It's gonna deal 2 damage to each creature. A great sweeper for 2 mana. The only thing better is Anger of the Gods for 1 extra mana, honestly. But if Dredge isn't really an issue for you and you think 2 is going to be sufficient to take care of your local meta, maybe there's a lot of Elf decks or whatever, Pyroclasm is actually pretty powerful. Entrancing Melody, you're stealing a creature, which is hilarious. I've done it plenty of times, and it's essentially always a win. I've stolen Death's Shadow, I've stolen some 5 CMC Angel, so many things. It's hilarious, and it just turns the tide. It really turns the table, because your opponent was planning something and then now they can't do it. So Entrancing Melody, awesome card. Yeah, if you're playing Izzet, give it a shot. It might be very useful for you in your meta. Echoing Truth, I was mentioning before, it could also be used against other types of cards because it's returning a non-land permanent, and all permanents with the same name to their owner's hands. So again, this is going to be useful against token decks, or mostly token decks, but even humans decks or aggro decks that have the same creature. It's going to be brutal, but realistically speaking, you don't really care about the second effect there, where it's saying all other permanents with the same name. At the end of the day, you just want to get rid of a permanent. whether it's a creature or something else, you know, Echoing Truth can be very powerful. And if you don't want to run cards like Dismember for whatever reason, Echoing Truth might be your option. Speaking of which, Dismember. You pay 4 life and 1 colorless, or one colorless mana. And target creature gets -5/-5, which usually kills creatures. And it also gets around indestructible, right? So Dismember is essentially a 1 CMC removal card for creatures in Modern. And it sees plenty of play in the sideboard. Again, depending on the types of cards you're having issues, what type of creatures you're having issues with dealing, Dismember might be a good option here, especially in Izzet decks. Again, you're mostly being offensive, not defensive, so Dismember might be a better option. You know, Dismember plus Bolt to get rid of a 6/6 creature or something, or a 7/7 or whatever type of big creature you're dealing with, maybe a very big Tarmogoyf, or Entrancing Melody to steal a Tarmogoyf, that would be better. But if you can't, Dismember is also very, very effective. Anger of the Gods, again, it's another sweeper, deals 3 damage to each creature. What's important here is that the creatures get exiled instead of going to the graveyard. For Dredge, this is like, oh boy, this is a big problem. So if you can survive 3 turns with Dredge, and then play Anger of the Gods when they cheated out like a trillion different little annoying creatures, it's essentially equivalent of game over. Because you're going to get rid of those creatures, they're not coming back, and it's probably going to set Dredge back a lot. And then you could probably finish them off. So Anger of the Gods, again, used to see a lot more play. If Dredge is an issue, this might be a tool you might want to include in your sideboard along with other Graveyard Hate. Because again, Graveyard Hate is good early on to stop your opponent from getting stuff onto the battlefield. But if Graveyard Hate is not in your opening hand, Anger of the Gods is good in your opening hand because you can deal with those creatures once they are on the battlefield. Right? So having those 2 vectors of attack are actually very useful. Again, depends on your meta. Kozilek's Return deals 2 damage to each creature. You're mostly playing Kozilek's Return to get around protection. So if you're worried about protection from red, for whatever reason in your meta, that's why a lot of us used to play with Kozilek's Return a lot. The secondary effect there is almost irrelevant. 99% of the time, people are playing Kozilek's Return for the main effect, which is deal 2 damage to each creature. It's the fact that it's dealing 2 colorless damage to each creature. So it gets around protection. Again, very specific meta call if you think you need it. Magmatic Sinkhole, very, very well, I wouldn't say it's very, very popular, but popular enough right now. It allows you to delve into your graveyard to cast it. So instead of playing 6 mana, you can pay 1 red and exile 5 cards from your graveyard. Boom, deal 5 damage to target creature or planeswalker. It's very cool here that you can also target a planeswalker and deal 5 damage. Essentially would kill every planeswalker in Modern. So very, very useful here if you're dealing with a lot of planeswalkers, a lot of big creatures. Magmatic Sinkhole is probably a better option than, let's say, Dismember or Flame Slash. So keep that in mind. If you're not worried about Indestructible and you fill up your graveyard quite a bit, and Izzet decks usually do because you're usually playing interactive, even if you're just diddling with yourself in the Storm deck, you're definitely filling up your graveyard. So your graveyard is often full, so Magmatic Sinkhole can probably be cast for less than 6 CMC. Alright, Aggro, Burn, Midrange. What are you going to do when you don't have green? Yeah, this page is usually full. This screen is usually full of cards, but they all need green. You don't have that in Izzet. Like I said, Izzet lacks that sustainability in the long game when it comes to grinding out with creatures, and that's very evident by the amount of cards you don't see on this screen. You just lose a lot of cards that are here. You don't have Huntmaster of the Fells, you don't have Elder Gargaroth, you don't have just a bunch of cards that require green. So what you do have is Shadow Spear, which is going to give your creature +1/+1 and give it Trample and Lifelink, which is pretty good. So, you know, whatever red or blue creature you have on the battlefield, this will pump it up and give it Lifelink and Trample. Trample probably less relevant, but Lifelink will be important here, so good against aggro and burn decks. Dragon's Claw almost exclusively is coming in against burn or red decks in general, because you're going to be gaining 1 life every time a player casts a red spell. That includes you, by the way. So, you know, 25 to 50% of your cards are also going to gain you 1 life, so which is very, very powerful. Burn decks do not like to see this because it basically says all your burn spells are -1, and it's a very, very powerful card. So if you are playing against a burn heavy meta, you might want to have maybe 3 of these, or some split between the 2 cards that you're seeing here in your sideboard. Last but not least, control and combo hate. Well, you're playing blue, So you have basically everything you need when it comes to counter spells. Again, this list is taking into account counter spells that are often played in the sideboard, not the main board. That's why you don't see Mana Leak and other cards here. These have pretty much been the same for the last two sideboard tech videos I put out. So Temur and Simic both have access to these spells. You have the same access in Izzet. This is going to be interesting in the next video where it's Gruul and you have no blue. Anyway, so the spell, counter target instant spell. More often than not, this is played in decks that are combo-ish more than anything else, because the spell is a 1 mana, so it's very mana efficient, and you're countering an instant spell, which means you're probably countering a counter, and that's where you're going to be playing the spell. That's really the only scenario where I would see you be playing the spell in your sideboard. Ceremonious Rejection, taking care of those big mana decks like Tron, Eldrazi, any deck that's essentially playing a lot of colorless spells. This is a 1 mana counter, essentially. Very, very, very powerful. Very powerful. Very, very powerful. I don't know what else to say. I've said everything I could in the past 2 videos. It shuts down Ugin, it shuts down Karn, it shuts down any Eldrazi, shuts down any artifact. It's amazing. Aether Gust, not my type of card, but if you are playing against a lot of red-green in your meta, very, very powerful card to play, because it does also get around cards like Cavern of Souls. So if you're playing against Valakut with Primeval Titan, oftentimes those decks play Cavern of Souls, which means, you know, they'll probably put Giant as the creature type on the Cavern of Souls, and then their Primeval Titans are protected from counter spells. Aether Gust doesn't counter. It just says target spell or permanent that's red or green goes on top or bottom of their opponent's library. They choose, but it doesn't really matter. The point is, if they're casting Primeval Titan, you can stop that cast essentially, or, you know, temporarily pause it. It's going to come back next turn, unfortunately, but you can pause it and then do whatever you got to do. Or you take care of a Primeval Titan that's already on the battlefield, or take care of any other green or red permanent, essentially. That's what Aether Gust is there for. Disdainful Stroke, very powerful card. Counters target spell converted mana cost 4 or greater. Again, big mana decks, control matchups that play, you know, some spells that are also 4 mana or more, in particular Cryptic Command. Disdainful Stroke, very, very powerful in those instances. Also counters Primeval Titan, for example. So I really like Disdainful Stroke. Negate sees less play nowadays, but it is a counter target non-creature spell for 2 mana. If for whatever reason you can't play Stubborn Denial in your deck because you don't have the type of creatures, and Izzet does not often have the type of creatures that would, you know, complement Stubborn Denial, Negate might be your second best option. Again, if you're really worried about non-creature spell decks, Negate is good. I don't know what else to say. It really also depends what your main board is packing. If you have a lot of Mana Leaks and other types of counter spells in your main, Negate might not be really relevant, right? If you're already playing Cryptic Command, you don't really need Negate. But maybe you do on the side. Again, it really depends on your meta. If you need to be a bit more efficient with your mana, because maybe the meta is really quick, Cryptic Command's a bit too slow, Negate might be your better option on the side to maybe replace Cryptic Command with. Logic Knot, yeah, it's another Delve card like Magmatic Sinkhole. So for 2 blue and X, X being how much your opponent's gonna have to pay, or, you know, for their spell to resolve. So counter target spell unless its control pays X. So you can delve as many cards as you want, essentially, or, you know, you don't have to delve at all, right? If you have 6 mana, then you can cast this for 4X, and your opponent has to pay 4. Or their spell gets countered, essentially. So that's how Logic Knot works. But you can also delve. You can delve 15 cards if you really want to, if you really don't want a spell to resolve. But usually you just, you know, you delve as many cards as necessary for your opponent not to be able to pay, right? If your opponent has 2 mana up, then you delve for 3, so on and so forth. Logic Knot can be useful. I think this comes down to playstyle and maybe specific deck mechanics more than anything else. Not really the type of counterspell I want to play, but in an Izzet deck where there's not too much competition for graveyard resources, Logic Knot might actually make a lot more sense. You know, in Simic decks and Temur decks, you have Tarmogoyfs and other cards that might be wanting to eat from your graveyard. Not so much in Izzet decks, so Logic Knot becomes a bit more relevant here. Last but not least, Mystical Dispute. Again, if you feel like you're going to be in a control-heavy meta, then this is a great card to play because it helps you win in counter battles, essentially. Because remember, in counter battles, mana is of the utmost importance, and so is sequencing. So being able to pay 1 instead of 3 to effectively have a Mana Leak effect, very, very powerful. your opponent might not expect it, or they might not have any way to answer it. So Mystical Dispute becomes very, very important in those instances, but it's not really specific to Izzet decks. It's any deck that can play blue. And that's it. Alright, didn't take as long as the other sideboard tech videos, but that's because we have less cards to talk about. I hope you found this really interesting, or at least somewhat interesting. I know a lot of you do. I know a lot of you seem to enjoy listening to me, which is weird. I mean, am I really that interesting? I guess some of you think so. That's great. I hope I am anyway. Stay tuned for more of these. Again, it seems to be pretty popular. I'm getting good feedback from this, so there's going to be more. Gruul is next, and I'm moving on to Sultai, and so on and so forth. I'm going to break those down. That's going to be really fun. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you enjoy my content in general, please subscribe, hit notification bell, follow me on Twitter. All that stuff seems easy for you, but for me, it means a lot, helps me out a lot. Plus, you get to stay up to date. A big thank you to all my patrons. If you're interested in becoming a patron, check out the link in the description. I have some pretty cool tiers. You're basically guaranteed to get mythics and rares at the end of every year, as long as you're a patron for, long enough, which is pretty cool. So even if you don't win in any of my other giveaways, this is essentially a giveaway that you are guaranteed to get if you become a patron. So check those out. Yeah, thanks and have a good one.